Hi, everyone. We're live. It's October 28th, 2023. I'm coming at you from a balmy, almost Halloween night here in New York, unseasonably warm. I've got my air conditioning on. I guess that's the trick. I'm here with three wonderful authors, Joe Kaplan, Brian Evenson, and Christie Nogle. Great to see you three.
Good to
How's
see you,
everybody
Joe.
doing? And we're going to talk about a new book from Anthology Press, which is a small press out of the UK. It's called A Darkness Visible. It's out now. You can get a copy. You can't get the green papers. That's my mess. But the book's called The Darkness Visible, Explorations of Horror in the Postmodern. It's edited by G.M. Miller, Ewan Moore, Lara Tapper, and Justin Burnett, who also has a story in the book. Before we start to talk about these stories, let me read to you about our guests, and then we will jump in. Joe Kaplan is the author of It Will Just Be Us and When the Night Bells Ring. Her short stories have appeared in Fireside Quarterly, Black Static, Nightmare Magazine, Visterion, Horror Library, Night Script, and award-winning anthologies. She has also published work as Joanna Parapinski. In addition to her writing, she teaches English and creative writing at Glendale Community College. She is currently the co-chair of the Horror Writers Association's Los Angeles chapter, and you can find more at joekaplan.com. Welcome, Joe. Great to see you.
You too.
Brian Evenson is the author of a dozen books, and most recently, the story collection, The Glassy Burning Floor of Hell. His penultimate collection, Song for the Unraveling of the World, which came out in 2019, won the Shirley Jackson Award and the World Fantasy Award, and was a finalist for the Ray Bradbury Prize. Other recent books include A Collapse of Horses and The Warren. His novel Last Days won the ALA RSUA Award for Best Horror Novel 2009. His novel The Open Curtain was a finalist for an Edgar Award and International Horror Guild Award. He lives in Los Angeles and teaches at Cal Arts, and a new collection, Good Night, Sleep Tight. Is that one out yet, Brian?
No, that's not out for like a year.
Okay. I'm reading from maybe a bit of a dated one. And also, which I just wanted to mention, you, most recent projects, I think you have two on my radar. You just edited an issue of McSweeney's, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. That's right.
Is it called, is it Monsters or Monstrosities? What's the title?
It's called The Monstrous and the Terrible is what it's called.
Looking forward to reading that. And I also saw, is there a limited, you probably got more work going on, but Weird House Press is doing a limited edition of something.
They are, yeah. They're doing a limited edition of a story collection, and they'll do a non-limited version too. But yeah, they just announced the limited one, so yeah.
Congratulations on those, and it's great to see you here.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Christie Nogle is the author of the Shirley Jackson Award nominated and Bram Stoker Award winning first novel, Balua, from Cemetery Gates Media, and the collections, The Best of Our Past, The Worst of Our Future, and Promise from Flame Tree Press. She is co-editor with Willow Dawn Becker of the Bram Stoker Award-nominated anthology, Mother, Tales of Love and Terror, and co-editor with Al Jiang of Wilted Pages, an anthology of dark academia. You can follow her at christienogle.com and on social media at Christie Nogle. Welcome, Christie. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you. I just want to correct. It's I-Jung is my co-editor.
I apologize. I-Jung, co-editor of Wilted Pages. I'm glad that you mentioned that. We were talking about that a little bit before. It sounds so interesting, an anthology of dark academia. I realized that I know you're no longer currently teaching, but the three of you are educators. And how much? The first question is how much dark fiction makes its way into the three of your curriculum? Anyone can take that first.
I will say I don't teach anymore, but when I taught intro to literature, everything was really dark, and the students all thought it was very morbid and creepy and dark.
So this was just the regular curriculum, like Poe or kind of something like that. Like what were some
Well,
of
no, I mean, you get this huge anthology, and you as a professor have to pick and choose what you focus on, and I always focused on the
Okay.
stuff that was creepy and morbid and dark.
Well
Okay,
done.
so it was pleasantly curated then. Okay. How about you two, Joe and Brian?
Do you want to go, Joe?
Sure. I have moved away from those giant anthologies because it's annoying having to pick. So I teach this. It's like the next course after English 101. It's critical thinking and literary analysis. So kind of like an intro to lit. And I do a Gothic theme. So I curated like public domain works and things that are accessible for free for the students to read. And so it's, Poe, obviously. The yellow wallpaper is one of my favorites. We read Dracula, so it's a really fun class. And I have had students also say, "Oh, this is all about death and it's dark." I'm like, well, that's the theme.
Well, it's part of life. Get used to it. I came across some of that stuff, like the Phantom of the Opera or Dracula, or some of that in maybe high school, and Poe. And yeah, are the students, Brian? Do the students see it as a distinction? Are they seeing it as part of the curriculum, or do you think that they're seeing it as horror, or what? What is there, from a student point of view? Is there like a genre lit distinction as much as we?
I don't think as much as there was when I was a student. So I teach in an art school, and as a result, I can kind of just teach whatever I want, which is super nice. So I teach an undergraduate class that's just horror fiction and film, and
Oh wow!
I get a lot of students who take that class because they're horror nuts, and then I get some students who take it because they just are like, I don't know anything about horror, and I want to try it and see what it's like. Or I get people who are like filmmakers, who are student filmmakers who want to make horror films, and so
Wow.
that's really fun. But I had a similar experience in terms of what both Christie and Joe were saying in terms of when I would teach like various classes, American lit classes, and other things. It's like you can take one of those anthologies and I gravitate towards certain sorts of things in them. And those things are dark, and I usually am very surprised when the students are like, "This is really dark," and I'm like, "Oh, I guess it probably is. It's just the stuff I like." So,
Wow, it sounds like great classes. I'll read a little bit that struck me from the introduction to A Darkness Visible, which is explorations of horror in the postmodern, which the book sounded a little bit academic to me, just the way that they're putting it. And here's how Gavin G.M. Miller started out the book. Imagine a body hurtling towards Earth, arms and legs flailing as they spiral through empty air. There is a sound of screeching wind, the concussive impact, and then unconsciousness. Upon waking, our fallen being peers into the obscurity surrounding them, eyes tracing the vague contours of an alien terrain. It is a world draped in midnight. The image belongs to Milton. It recounts the moment when Satan, cast from heaven, first lay eyes upon the kingdom over which he is doomed to preside. The landscape is shadowy and obscure, we are told, a world of utter darkness, but a darkness that can be glimpsed and observed, no light, but rather darkness visible. So that's where we get the title of this, A Darkness Visible. I'm woefully underread. I haven't read Milton, but I liked the way he started it off with a darkness. I guess we're really diving into the dark, a darkness that can be observed, and it set the stage that these stories were going to be dark, but also I think the editors were looking not so sure if the word is deviation from form, but which gets me to my first question for the panel. I guess he was looking for the postmodern, which is in its most basic different from perhaps the classics. What how do the three of you feel on when you were asked to write the book? What do you feel is postmodern, or if not a feeling like what is postmodern? For someone like me who I'm not as well versed in perhaps the terminology. If anyone wants to take a bite out of that first notion.
I'll start. So I
Okay.
I have a degree in critical theory, and so did a lot of work in things like that.
So I've asked one of the right people then.
Yeah, maybe, but it's also like I over time I came to feel like postmodernism gets used in so many ways as a term that it's very hard to know what it means exactly. But I think maybe in a context like this, what we're talking about is horror fiction that doesn't act in exactly the way that we think of horror fiction as acting. That it kind of becomes potentially referential. It kind of starts to kind of bend the boundaries a little bit. So, and I think one of the things that was interesting when I was working on the McSweeney's anthology is like trying to convince them, no, this is horror. Because I think people have this notion of what horror is that maybe is dated in the 70s. And there's nothing wrong with that horror in particular, but the genre has just so kind of spread and expanded. And so I guess
we've come so far.
Yeah. So
expanded so far. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that's what I would say is it's just that it's an attempt to collect things that are kind of interrogating what horror is and taking different kinds of chances.
I love that definition because, and maybe that's why I was drawn towards this project and why I've really enjoyed your three stories so much. In that, there's nothing wrong with 70s horror or classic horror or some of the stories we were talking about before, but I guess the stuff that really excites me is, as you put it, just the ones that are pushing the boundaries or are interrogating or playing with the expectations. Joe and Christie, what was your reaction and take on the postmodern aspect of the book?
I don't know.
I mean, you can just pass on it.
It's such a great question, and I mean, Brian put it really well when he said that postmodern has been used in so many ways that it's hard to pin down exactly what it is. And I feel like I struggle to have a really clear sense of what it is. One thing I found really interesting, though, about where the opening of this came from, that bit that you just read, and kind of starting with Milton. There's a strong thread going back to the Gothic, which is clearly not not the postmodern, but that's more of my forte. And so much of that was inspired by Milton. I mean, you have direct references in Frankenstein. And it's I like, though, the idea of how Paradise Lost recasts the traditional view of God and Satan. It asks us to empathize with the figure traditionally viewed as evil. And so I guess the idea of that shifted perspective, looking at things in a way that is strange, unusual, that kind of almost recasts reality into this unfamiliar lens. I feel like that to me is maybe part of the postmodern, but I could also just be talking out of my ass here.
No, you're not. You're not. I love two things. Not that I have any authority to say you're not, but I love that you said recasting reality, because we're going to talk about all three of your stories, and that's a thread that I saw in all three of the stories, and what's classic today was at its time, rebellious or innovative, and I think maybe by definition, postmodern, maybe it has to exist not in a vacuum, but in relation to something else. So I think it perhaps was a wise choice to to start with a reaction to the Gothic without judgment. Like Brian said, oh yeah, we're expanding, not like progressing, but yeah, you can have 70s horror, you can have this horror, you can have that, and then we have something else. Christie, what's your take on the postmodern?
Yeah, so as they were already saying, there's a lot of different interpretations. So when I think of postmodernism, I think of like pastiche and metafiction, self-referentiality, breakdown of things like what's considered canon or what's considered classic. It's just on and on and on. But the wonderful thing is, in an anthology, you don't have to really choose on a single definition because you're looking at a number of different people's takes on a topic. And so that's really the beauty of an anthology. And I think that's the beauty of an anthology on such a slippery term as this too.
Yeah, it's super fun. I'll bite on that question. I'll admit to saying when I was presented with it, I was telling the editors, or at least one of them, I was like, I have no idea what that topic is, but here's the idea that came to me, and if I write it, is that maybe okay? So like, I guess we're going to the old Supreme Court definition, perhaps, of like pornography. Like, I'll know it when I see it, perhaps, but I think that's pretty off there. But Christie, it's great that you mentioned that. Yeah, it's so fun that you don't really have to have a rigid definition, and that's what was fun for me looking at all four of our stories together when was considering doing this. And while a theme showed itself, the theme is the labyrinth. All four of the stories that we have here are very different stories about labyrinths, but they are stories about labyrinths, and they are all stories that have a different. They all have a different take on horror. Does anyone want to talk about their approach to how the labyrinth and how their take on horror came about, either in the process or manifesting the story? Brian, your story is called is it called The Sunken Circle or A Sunken Circle?
I think it's just Sunken Circle. I don't remember. Sunken Circle. Yeah. And
for me, the horror in that story defies, right? So it defies obviously the most common, perhaps, movie expectations of horror. This is not a jump scare story. So what is horror? We have in this story someone who is threading the needle between perception and reality, between maybe even questioning their own sanity. How did that come about for the character? Was it Ari? The character Ari?
Yes, it was Ari. Yeah.
And because I remember, I just read it, and I remember there was one point where she thinks her name is an anagram of air when she's just like kind of grasping for something.
Yeah,
I thought that was cool. So how did Ari and the Labyrinth and postmodern horror come about for you?
Well, so I think that story started. We were I had a sabbatical last year, and we spent some time in Europe, and I believe it was in France, but it might have been somewhere else. We came across these mazes that are kind of not mazes, where it's just a kind of strip, and so you can see the whole maze. It's something that's in the concrete, and that fascinated me. You know, it's like a starter maze or something. It's the maze that you can never actually get lost in, and you can step out of. And I started thinking about that, and then I started thinking, when I used to teach at Brown University, every time they would do like a graduation, they would these workmen would show up in the quad and just change a bunch of stuff, and like put in a bunch of flowers for the parents for like 3 days, and then like as soon as it was done, they'd be torn out again. And so those two ideas kind of came together for me, and then I began thinking about the thing I found when I would walk one of those mazes is I had a very difficult time telling myself I could just step out of it. That there's something psychological about once you start to follow a maze, even if you know you can kind of step out of it and break the rules, it can be hard. And so I kind of went from there to thinking about, what would it be like if, as you begin to go through this maze, it starts to become something else. So
That really comes across in the story. Living in New York, I can at least relate to the fact that things turn around, like businesses come and go, and the physical structure of the city sometimes. I live outside New York, so I come and go, and sometimes things change so fast where you almost don't have a grasp on the landscape anymore. Whereas I imagine, like in a completely rural setting, the landscape just like doesn't change that fast. Where I don't think there's a word for it yet, but I felt it when reading your story of just like, did I dream that? And did I imagine it? Am I slipping?
yeah.
But
Yeah, and that's her
dreams.
experience too. I mean, I think that's part of the thing I try to do with a lot of my fiction is have an experience that the reader undergoes that is similar, at least analogous to what the character's going through.
Yeah, I think you did that really effectively, and I'm not sure if you're going to read from the beginning or the end of your story, but it's not, I guess, a spoiler warning for those about that. But for this, the story ends up in a place where we're talking about expectations. Um, it ends with a realization, and I guess for me, without saying what that realization is, it's where the character. Maybe the realization is just like her realization or the solid ground that she thought she had is not. And I thought that was really effective and what I liked about it. So I think it's a great introduction. I'm going to attempt to turn it over to Brian and take it away.
Yeah. I probably will just read the from the beginning, and I have about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'll read as far as I can take it. It's not a long story, but I think it's longer than what I could do in that amount of time. So this is Sunken Circle, and I'll read the first section and maybe the second section. 1. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 10 a.m., as Ari walked from the dorms to her Intro to Classics class, she passed it. A circular area, slightly sunken on the edge of the quad. 4 shallow steps leading down to it, a 2-brick-high edge running a circle around it, only broken where the lowest step crossed into the circle. Inside was some sort of pattern, a glinting network of lines on the concrete. Whether painted or chiseled into the concrete and gilded, she couldn't say. Some sort of art installation? The first time, she was already running behind, and it wouldn't do to be late to her first class of the semester. And after that class, she had to go all the way across campus for stats, so she wouldn't go back the same way. In the weeks since, she had noticed it again, thought about it again, thought about going over and taking a closer look, but somehow she seemed to notice it only when she was in a rush to be somewhere else. Still, it gently tugged at her. Sometimes at night, as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking about this half-glimpsed pattern, curiosity raising its slick, wet head from the river of approaching sleep. I should go take a closer look, she would think, and then she drifted off. When Ari finally did decide to go take a look, it was on a different day, a Wednesday, in the late afternoon. One of her classes had been canceled, the professor, so the rumor was, having had a sort of breakdown earlier in the day. In any case, the department chair of literary arts showed up and without explanation told them all to go home. And so, suddenly, having time on her hands, she walked back toward the dorms. As she crossed the quad, she found herself thinking, I should go take a closer look. So she took the trek over. She walked closer to where the sunken circle was, but the funny thing was that there was nothing there. Nothing at all. This portion of the quad looked just like the rest, several triangles of grass, various crossing pavement paths around them. She came closer to the place she remembered the circle being, but there was nothing there. Nor even, she thought, as she looked closer, the trace of anything ever having been there. How long had it been since she had last seen it? A week ago? 2? It It was hard to remember. The semester, her first at college, had become a blur. Maybe a month. It was possible, of course, that it had been exactly what she thought it had been, an art installation. And when the installation finished, and when the installation finished, ground crews had moved swiftly in and taken up the bricks, removed what to her had looked like a circle of pavement, but perhaps was something else entirely, and sodded everything over again. That was possible, wasn't it? Not impossible, anyway. But wouldn't she have seen them at work on a Tuesday or a Thursday when she had passed? Not if she hadn't been looking. Not if she'd been distracted by something else, being late to class, for instance, which had happened more than she would care to admit since the semester had gotten busy. And maybe they had started taking out the installation on a Friday, and by the time she walked by again on Tuesday, they were done. That was plausible, even if they hadn't worked on the weekend. Nothing to see, Ari told herself, nothing to pay attention to. She sighed, then went back to the dorms to study. Which made it all the more surprising when, a day later, on Thursday, on the way to class, the circle was there. Ari stopped, amazed. Had she somehow missed it before? But no, she had been standing there, exactly there, where there was now a sunken circle, 4 steps leading down. That, too, she realized, was significant. How could they have broken up and filled in the steps so quickly? No, she must be mistaken. Coming from her literary arts class, she must have somehow gotten turned around and looked in the wrong place. But hadn't the statue of the Bruin that was the college's mascot been just there, where it was now, just to the right in her field of vision, when she was on the edge of the circle? She was almost certain it had been. But maybe she'd been upset, troubled by the fact that her professor had, apparently, even though the chair himself hadn't said so, but of course all the students had, a breakdown. Surely it could be written off to that. If it wasn't that, what else could it be? It wasn't like reality could shift or change. It must be a problem with her, simply something she hadn't seen correctly. She was right there. This was real. She could see that it was real. It didn't matter if she was late to class, even if midterms were approaching. It was more important that she finally see what this thing actually was. She took a step down, just one. Perhaps 6 inches, one shallow step down. Something in the air seemed to shift and change. Air, that word, Ari thought, had always seemed like a misspelling of her own name. Or maybe her name was a misspelling of that word. She took another step, down to the second step, a foot below the quad, if that. Sound was muffled now. Was that possible? It didn't seem like it could be. Could it? She took another step. Third step now. Only one left and she would be there. Or just above, there were 4 steps and then the circle. She took another step and there she was, just barely above the pattern. It was, she could see now, a kind of maze, but inscribed on the concrete itself, a series of lines in gold. But what point was there to having a maze that you could see all at once from above? Were the lines really gold? Some bright shiny metal anyway, maybe fool's gold or brass or pinchbeck. How did she even know the word pinchbeck? She wasn't sure, but somehow she knew it. She stepped down. She placed her foot on the rounded golden nub that indicated the beginning of the maze, its initial path. The noise of the quad around her fell utterly silent. She looked desperately around, but saw nobody, no one at all. It was as if she was the only one who existed in the world. Ari, she heard, whispered in many voices. Ari, come. She was not sure where the voices were coming from. Probably from somewhere inside her. What was wrong with her? She shook her head. The voices stopped. She hesitated there, one foot touching the golden nub that began the maze etched on the pavement, the other foot still on the step. Should I? She wondered. She hesitated for a long time, and then hesitated some more, and then, out of fear, drew her foot back and climbed slowly back up the stairs. Later, back at her dorm, she began to regret this. What would it have hurt to go in? It was only a series of lines on concrete, not an actual maze. Probably she would have wandered briefly along the paths and then simply stepped over the lines and crossed back to the stairs and left. But she had felt something so strange when she had been standing there, one foot touching the maze and one foot above, that she hadn't been able to force herself to go in. She had been too afraid. But wasn't that ridiculous? What could have happened to me? Absolutely nothing. I should have done it, Ari thought. I should have walked the maze. But she had not. A few days later, in an idle moment, Ari asked her roommate if she'd ever walked it. Walked what? Her roommate said. The maze, she said. You know, the thing etched into the pavement in one corner of the quad. Her roommate frowned, furrowed her brow. Where on the quad? She asked. And when Ari described it, that's just grass there. No, said Ari. You probably thought it was grass because you haven't gotten a close look. We walk by things all the time without noticing them. Her roommate gave her a tittering laugh. I'm pretty sure there's nothing there, she said, but whatever, you do you. 2. For a while, she simply avoided that corner of the quad. She deliberately didn't look in that direction when she walked to Classics and otherwise took a roundabout path going home. Maybe the pavement maze was really there, maybe not. What did it matter? Better not to think about it and just go on with her life. She met someone in her writing workshop, a boy named Theodore, though he went by Teddy. He was nice enough, black shaggy hair, gangly body. They made out a few times, and then one night he showed up with a growler of beer that he'd gotten an upperclassman to fill for him, and they drank it down, and giddy walked hand in hand down the hill to the Dorrance, and somehow convinced the bartender to serve them a cocktail. The bartender knew they were underage. Of course he did. He wouldn't serve them at the bar, set them up at a table, and made them order food, too. If someone comes in, he told them as he set the drinks down, these are mocktails. If they ask to taste them, just say no. When later they tried to order a second one, he just smiled and shook his head and pointed at the door. They crossed over the canal and trudged back up the hill, still holding hands. Going uphill was hard, and Ari was out of breath and a little sweaty, her head still unsteady from drink by the time she arrived at the top. Teddy, though, seemed just as relaxed as always. They went up the brick walk alongside the library and through the gate and past the administration building, crossing through the quad to get back to the dorms. Hey, look, said Teddy, what's that? What? She said. Over there, he said. A weird senior project or something, he said. Some art thing. She was afraid to look, but she looked anyway. There it was, just as she had left it days before, waiting for her. Come on, she said, and tugged at him. Just a minute, he said, and then, let's take a look. And she was both enamored enough with him and drunk enough that when he began to tug her toward the maze, she found she couldn't resist. 1 step, then 2, then 3, then 4. There he was in front of her, leading her down. There they both were, at the bottom of the stairs, his foot on the golden nub that began the line, her own feet not far behind. Ted, she said, Ted. How have I never noticed this before, he said, his voice shot through with wonder. Let's go back, she said. Sure, he said, but not yet, in just a bit. And he stepped down into the maze. She, smitten and confused, being pulled forward by the hand grasping her hand, not knowing what else to do, panic beginning to grow, followed. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
A couple of things to say about that. I love the line, and the reason I chose to have you read that story first. There's just that sneaky gun on the mantelpiece line that goes with the theme of these stories tonight. It wasn't like reality could shift or change or anything that she's thinking to herself. It just sort of this like line in the trope. It's actually a trope I don't like. I tend to not like, maybe because it's so often not executed well. I just don't like the tropes of is it real or is it not real? I guess maybe from watching too much bad TV, it's not. But that was so wonderfully executed, that little line, and the way that it really sets up and plays it. And also my second comment on the story is the name of the series is Nighttime Logic, which is inspired by my perception of a trope or a term or something used by Robert Aikman for his Strange Tales. So I'm always looking at whether I can help it or not. I'm always looking at a story to see, is it a strange tale or not? Is there intentional ambiguity? Can the story be viewed, because it delights me, can the story be viewed is this something supernatural at play, or is this something psychological at play? And looking under that lens of analysis, this goes right down the pipe of A Strange Tale. When you get to the end of this, it operates wonderfully both within the four corners of the story, but it also, at least to me, was like I didn't. I think any two people could walk away from that story and just be like, "Oh, I love how that was an example of a psychological thing at play."
Yeah.
And your partner across the table could be like, "Oh, no, no, it's this."
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really delicate balance, and that's something that is that I strive for. I don't always get there, but just trying to find something where it's not clear if it's really happening or not, or it's not clear if it's supernatural or going on inside the person. So, and usually I guess the answer is both. It's hard just to say where one starts and the other begins, ends.
And it's fascinating to look at that. I mean, I think those kind of stories are entertaining and thought-provoking enough, just for on its own end. But when you mention it, say it's hard to say one way or the other. I think that's perhaps that's where the horror of it comes in, especially for the character, because you made it look easy, because when that story ends, when the ends place on that story, I felt horror for that character. I felt like that character did not know one way or the other, and at that point was when I really felt for her. So
great, yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's exciting. Before I forget, we have one of the editors is with us in the chat. Owen Moore is with us. Welcome. And he says, they say, I must admit, I felt I had little to no knowledge of what the postmodern and what it is. After months of research, years of reading, I know even less. And that's such a great comment, right? Like the more you know, the less you know. And I think it works wonderfully with the subtitle of the book, Explorations of Horror in the Postmodern. So thanks so much for that comment. It's great to have one of our editors here. Another thing I loved about reading these stories together was seeing the different takes in horror, but actually seeing the different takes on the actual labyrinth. Like Brian's story has this etching that at one point becomes these golden curtains, and Joe's story starts off like with an almost bird's eye view of a cityscape of people as ants and looking down on it. So it's great that you get to see different different sensory and different physicalities of where these stories are going. And Joe's story as well is one of those stories that plays with the notion of like, you think you knew what was going on, but you don't, and it doesn't really to great effect. How did you work your way into the labyrinth and approach starting your story, Joe?
Well, I think labyrinths are fascinating. I mean, it's this one single circuitous path that goes in one direction. Like you were talking about, like Brian was talking about too. It's not a maze with so many diverging paths. It's just the one. But there's also this feeling of somehow being both lost and obviously not lost, because there's just the one path. So I kind of wanted to explore the labyrinth, but not in an actual labyrinth, not like the actual labyrinth, but seeing it, I guess, manifest in an actual, like in this case, in the city. So I think a lot of horror stories and a lot of horror that I write tends to take place in more like desolate or even rural areas. So I definitely wanted to write something in a city. And the idea is that there's, this character there's a sense of inevitability, I guess, for the character who is navigating the city, because he feels like he's lost on the one hand because it's like all these crazy roundabout little like streets that are one way and it's hard to navigate. But at the same time, there is that inevitability of he's going to this one place and he's going to end up there, um, both physically and I guess psychologically because he's also mentally circling around this one core memory that he can't get away from. And so there's, yeah, I guess there's this sense of like circling and inevitability while simultaneously feeling off balance because you're going on this windy, totally circuitous route to get where you're going. It's not like a straight line. Um, so those were kind of some of my thoughts about the labyrinth and how I wanted to play with it in the story. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. Oh, and you answered it and then some. One of the things that I loved about your approach and that I loved about the story was how, at least to this reader, I saw the labyrinth as being literal. There was a literal labyrinth that you could visually see as labyrinth, but perhaps even more so than Brian's story. Not that we're just looking at it on a continuum. There was also a different labyrinth that I felt, and that was like the labyrinth of time. And a duality of this character being both 7 and 27, or being at both points. And I guess I'm reacting to you and saying, "Oh, the labyrinth is just one way through it." And I see what you're saying, but I'm also saying, "Wow, that my experience of your presentation of the labyrinth was much more than just a linear thing," and I love that about it. I'm not sure if you're going to get to read this little part. There was one point that the character is talking about their father, and I love stories that when you really do feel the difference in time, and you captured that for me when the main character was talking about a lack of a GPS or a GPS failing, but then going back to their father and saying, like, when Dad navigated this, they didn't exist, and there's a little moment where he's like, "Oh, it's always in there," and then there's just this little tinge of horror where he says, like, in his adult sense, because he's sort of like in both places at once, he's like, and that's when I realized he was always lost, and that was just such a killer line. I just really related to that line, and I liked it a lot.
I love the way that you brought up the time, though, because even though it is the one path, there's this element of the labyrinth that it folds back in on itself, kind of. So I think that's what I was thinking of, like with there's almost like time kind of folding back on itself recursively as the character is experiencing both the memory and what's happening currently. I love playing around with time when I write.
And you do it so well, and it makes me feel better about my story. I'm not going to read from my story tonight, but one of the questions I asked the editors when I was submitting this, I'm like, "We're clear and we're cool that there's actually going to be no physical labyrinth in my story, and we're going to be okay with that." So it's cool to see all the stories on the different continuum of that, and to see the element of time being used so effectively, in addition to a lot of other things that are going on. There's a lot of layers to the story. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to Joe to read from Where All the Streets Lead.
Okay. So I'm just going to start at the beginning. This is Where All the Streets Lead. My father went into the city often when I was a child. I would beg him to take me along with him, my voice pitching to a whine, until he sighed and smiled and told me to go hop in the car while he collected his briefcase. From the passenger seat, I watched the flat brown plains give way to cookie-cutter suburban houses with white trim, and then the gray shadow of the city looming ahead. From far away, it seemed a singular entity, but as we drew closer, it opened its arms to envelop us. Steely buildings stood crowded together, tall and unbroken, so that I had to press my face to the window and look up just to see where they met the sky. Even though they threw the world in shadow, the street remained warm with hot metal, with movement. Something about their towering heights fascinated me. I wanted to design buildings like these. buildings that would someday make other kids look up in wonder. At their bottoms, people moved like deliberate ants, dwarfed by their surroundings, walking in tandem toward unknown destinations. Sometimes my father would take the long way around, winking at me as if it were a game, but I imagined he did it because of how I liked to ride along the skyscraper-lined streets, and he liked to indulge me, as he did every time I begged to come along with him, at first feigning like he would say no, shaking his head, but smiling all the while. We snaked along the grid, first left, then right, down one-way roads where the rest of the traffic flowed along with us, just like we were those ant people moving together, except we were car people, wearing an exoskeleton of rubber and steel. Eventually, we would pull into a huge concrete parking structure, pass beneath a series of buzzing yellow lights, and stop. "Wait here," my father would tell me as he grabbed his briefcase. "I'll only be a few minutes." While he was gone, I would count the other cars, try to guess their license plate numbers, tally up the different makes and models I could see. He usually didn't take long enough for me to get bored. One day, he never came back. When I tell my fiance the firm has asked me to pitch my concept for the proposed Bradley Center, a mixed-use building with shopping and apartments surrounding a central courtyard, in person, she pats my arm indulgently and reminds me what a major opportunity this is. "You know how much I hate to drive in the city." "I know," she says. "There's always so much traffic." I see concern in the downward curve of her lips, the slight crease between her honey brown eyes, and I can hardly blame her. She is engaged to a man who designs buildings he has no desire ever to set foot in, or even see in person for that matter. She's hinted at the benefits of therapy and suggested my relationship with my profession may be unhealthy, but her concern has never extended further than this. She tells me she enjoys the quiet out here in the exurbs. I've never quite been able to articulate to her how the city repulses me now, even as I can't escape it. She pecks me on the cheek through the open window and says, "Drive safe." "Wait here," I tell her. A laugh escapes her as she steps back from the car. "Where else would I go?" As I pull down the road, I see her wave in the rearview mirror, becoming smaller with distance where she stands in front of our little cottage and the wide open fields around it, the tree line beyond, until I can't see her anymore. When the flat brown plains give way to cookie-cutter suburban houses with white trim, my stomach twists and my heart pumps erratically. I am both behind the wheel and in the passenger seat. I am both 7 and 27, as if the gulf between these numbers does not exist. That day in the parking garage, I had the sense of time passing, but I couldn't tell how much, as my father had taken the keys to the car, leaving the clock display black and empty. I knew only that I had grown bored with my games and then antsy. He'd never left me waiting this long before, and it made me anxious in a way that I had never been, but that I would be again and again thereafter. Perhaps I have never stopped feeling this way. After a while, my bladder grew uncomfortably full, and eventually, after squirming in my seat, I could no longer hold it in. Though he had told me to wait here, meaning inside the car, I pushed open the door and stepped out into the parking garage, realizing I had never really been inside this structure before. We even kept the windows up when we drove in, so now I smelled it for the first time, oily and damp with car exhaust. The lights above were spaced too far apart, leaving uneasy intervals of darkness. I ran to the far wall to relieve myself in a pool of shadow. My urine mingled with dirt and grime. When I turned back from the wall, I was faced with rows and rows of cars, more cars than I had counted in my game to pass the time, and they went on and on as far as I could see, like huge, sleeping beetles. My eyes scanned the nearest row, but could not pick out my father's black sedan from the 100 other black sedans just like it. I ran up and down the row, trying to remember the license plate, but it kept getting scrambled in my mind, and none of those I passed looked familiar. I ran to the next row and the next, my sneakers pounding emptily on the concrete until I saw two tall, thin shapes in the distance. Thinking one of them must be my father, I raised my arms and yelled, but they did not return my wave. They were far away, at the end of the long row of cars, indistinguishable from the ant people who walked the streets. The way they moved frightened me like bobbleheads on skinny bodies, and I began to weep as I backed away down the next aisle. Except each new aisle I explored was populated by several more, like stick figures expressed as shadows, their heads large but featureless, their bodies spindly and stiff, and they drew lurchingly closer. In my panic, I became convinced they wanted to eat me. Later, I realized they must have been people, just people, going to or from their cars. But then why did they frighten me so? Fucking GPS, I grumble as the map takes me left and right and left again through the city. Sweat sticks my palms to the wheel. All around, buildings form a 75-foot wall, casting the street in perpetual dusk. The sky feels far away. For some reason, no matter how many turns I take down new roads, the GPS never indicates that I'm any closer to 8771 March Circle, my destination. My anxiety only fuels my frustration. With the city's infuriating one-way streets where traffic pours endlessly, like a river on its inevitable course, and its hulking structures boned with scaffolding, their black windows reflecting the sun, blocking out the horizon. I keep my attention split between the bumpers ahead and the map on my phone, its blue arrow pointed ever forward, conducting me along an elaborate pattern I cannot begin to understand. But this cannot be the fastest way. A thought comes to me, that my GPS is playing with me, winking at me. This thought makes me want to knock my phone off its stand, to punish it, but my hands remain locked on the wheel. With no idea how to navigate these streets, I am wholly reliant on it. The thought disturbs me. I wish abruptly to be sitting in the passenger seat, my feet not quite touching the floor, without worry because my father is in the driver's seat, and I am too young to see the dark edges of what it means to be wholly reliant on him. I had no idea how to get out of the parking garage. No GPS, no conductor. That's why I was found huddled in a corner, sobbing and scratching at the wall so hard my fingernails bled. I was afraid because I was lost and alone. They had to knock me out in the ambulance. Cars around me stop and start in waves. The map signals a right turn ahead, but then the arrow vanishes and a notification appears indicating no service. When my father drove, he always knew his way around. I never saw him check a map, and when I asked him once how he got around without one, he pointed to his head and said, "It's all up here." He never said anything more than that, so I was left to wonder if his sense of direction was some intrinsic semi-magical ability that I might someday inherit, or something that didn't cross my mind at the time, that he had spent hours studying maps because he hated the idea of getting lost, because he was already lost. I know where the GPS said to turn right before it lost connection, but I have no idea where to go from there. Still, following the last direction I received seems better than nothing, so I flip on my blinker and inch my way through the turn. A seemingly identical street unspools ahead of me with the same types of stone and steel buildings as the other streets, and I wonder how I will discern one from the next. All I can do is watch the passing signs for March Circle. In my peripheral vision, the sidewalks teem with moving people, and I find myself glancing left and right to catch the skittering dark figures I swear are lurking just out of sight, though I never do. I tell myself they are not here, they were only in the parking garage. No, only in my mind, my traumatized mind. No one seemed to blame me for my episode in the parking garage, and it all came out that they were sorry for me because of what happened to my father. He had taken the elevator to the top of the building and then climbed the stairs to the roof where he knew the door was unlocked. It was a ritual of his, I suppose. That's what he was doing. He would tell my mom and me he was conducting business in the city, but he wasn't. There were no records of him ever having a meeting inside that building. What he did was go to the top and look out, just for a few minutes, to feel far away from the world. Maybe he relished the way the wind up there gusted strong enough to send him over the edge. That day, his briefcase smashed to pieces beneath his body, and his head cracked open like a coconut and spilled out everything that was inside. Only one piece of paper fluttered out of the broken briefcase, and on that paper only one sentence had been printed. I finally found the way. I can leave it there.
Oh, I hope I didn't cut you short, but wow, that's
No,
that's a hell of a place.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a scene. It's a hell of a scene break. I love that scene. It's so cinematic. Like as you're reading it, I'm just like, and I'm putting some notes. I'm like, someone make mean, we have the story, but like I could see this as one hell of a film. Man, that's effective. Just that scene of just the kid sitting there like feeling alone and scratching at the wall, and that's not even the worst of it. So, and that's not even all. That's not even the main thrust of the horror. As you're reading it, I'm thinking, what one of the other things I like about this story is the structure of it, and I'm wondering how structure comes into play with horror and postmodern horror, with the aspect of defying expectations. So it's like a story still has to be horror, right? It has to be, at least the things I like, it's still close enough to horror where you recognize it as horror, yet it defies expectation to be just different enough where it feels fresh or different, or it's challenged you. And two pieces of media that your story, without any spoilers, favorably reflect on structurally was the film Talk to Me. I got some elements of Talk to Me structurally, not and I don't think you've read it yet, but Skinder's Veil by Kelly Lake. They're all three of these stories are very complicated, but they end, at least for me, they end on a similar structural place. So well done. Thank you so much for that reading. And also, it's another beat of how dreams and dreams and reality come into play. And in our next story by Christie Nogle, dreams are very much in play as well. And we have again another very unique, very effective, different sort of a labyrinth, different sort of a maze. And one of the mazes where we're dropped into the story is we have a maze of the family dynamic of current past traumas and current dynamics playing out as it moves into the horror and moves into the labyrinth. How did that come about for you, Christie, in the story when setting to the task of making it happen?
So this story starts with the idea of a family where the different members each have different worldviews and agendas. They're really not communicating, or I guess, they're communicating, but they're not on the same page. The main character has a kind of creepy, voyeuristic interest in his niece, who has come out of a cult-like religion.
One of the things I liked so much about the labyrinth that you presented was how there was a correspondence between events that were happening in the real world, in the present scene of the story, and in the revelation when it's one of the characters reveals the supernatural or the heightened reality of how the dream aspect, or the dream home, or the dream labyrinth. I loved how those two. It felt very supernatural, and it felt like it had its own dream and own horror logic to it. What can you tell us about injecting that horror aspect and about that supernatural element that you created?
One part of the story is based on a dream I had when I was a kid. And I recounted it to my mother afterward, not realizing it was a dream, and said, I was over in that building, and they were, describing all these creepy things that I had seen in this building, as though, because I was convinced it was real. So I guess at some point when you're a kid, you realize, you're going to categorize some things into like deja vu or a dream or what have you, and it's not really supernatural, but you don't necessarily start off with that knowledge. And I guess that's kind of the inspiration for part of this.
It seems like that is a way. It had a lot of verisimilitude to it, right? It seems like that's one of the things we as humans do. Perhaps.
Okay, it's not everybody that's frozen, but
No,
Daniel's.
you were frozen for a minute.
Are we back? Sorry about that. We were taking a stroll through the dream labyrinth there, but I guess I was saying there's a verisimilitude the way we react to the unknown or the supernatural in our own lives. You know, whether we ignore it, we don't believe it, we don't see it as being different, or perhaps we don't get closure on it. Perhaps it just is presented, and it just is. The story's called A Maze in Tall Grass, and this is a good point to turn it over to Christie to read from the story.
Okay. Thank you. And this isn't the very beginning. This is going to be, if you're following along, second section on 332 is where it starts. After dinner, we select a 1,000-piece puzzle of sea anemones. Joan does a big, dramatic yawn with her arm angled over her mouth. Her eyes are hollow and dark. We spread the puzzle on the enormous coffee table so we can keep Dad company, even though the light is too low and the TV is blaring. It's the local news, at least, not Fox. Mom has nothing to say, but it's soothing. A rundown of scandals and medical procedures amongst the neighbors, interspersed with comments about the news. Hey, wait, this is the cute weatherman, everybody. Look, he reminds me of that boy Maggie used to see in high school. What's his name? Fuck, I don't know, Mom, says my sister. It's 1,000,000 years ago. Mom closes her mouth and she'll pout like that until someone's nice to her again. My niece Chloe sits straight, gathers a dozen pink pieces and puts them together just like that. Gathers green pebbly pieces and puts them together. You have a real eye for color, I say. I expect that she'll blush and say thank you, but she only locks eyes with me a moment before going for another color. Her irises are green-gray with amber centers, very unique. I feel, as I have before, that she could be very appealing if she had a different soul, if she had Maggie's way of being, or Joan's, or even Mom's. I say, I hear you're interested in art. Chloe gets up and takes her colored pencils and sketchbook out of her bag. I think she'll bring it over for me to see, but instead she curls up on the sofa behind me. I'm making her uncomfortable. Later, Joan will ask why I suck up to the girl. Mom will repeat how ungrateful and spoiled she is. But I guess I'm just curious about her. Is that so wrong? Her mom tries to help by talking up her talent, comparing her work to that of abstract artists that Chloe must have taught her about. She's mispronouncing the names. Kandinsky is the one I like, she says. He's really good. Picasso, says Dad, and he goes on to deliver his grand opinion on modern art. Chloe's pencils scratch on the page. She must be seething. She likes to leave a room in a huff, but she doesn't do it this time. Why? I had the strangest dream last night, Maggie says. She tells us how she remodeled a house with no exterior walls and how she farmed an acre held up over the forest on stilts. Mom says, I once dreamed that you kids were miniature, maybe half the size of Barbie dolls. You ran over the kitchen counters playing hide and seek and slept under the napkins in the wells of the utensil organizer and swam in the enamel sink. Joan yawns again and squeezes my knee, but I don't feel ready to give up. Nothing's been gained from this day yet. I ask if Mom remembers the weird dream I had that time in a motel. She doesn't, but I go on. The dream itself is vague, but what I remember so vividly is sitting on the bed with Mom afterward, looking out the window on a moonlit night. Outside the window, there was a long stretch of tall grass and then the highway, another stretch of grass and an expansive parking area around an enormous warehouse. I say, I'd probably never been in a motel before, and who knows why we were there. Mom, Dad, and Maggie all say they don't remember. I'd certainly never seen such a large, low building and must have made note upon arrival of it. Now I'd woken in the darkness and was telling my mom about the dream, only I didn't realize it had been a dream. I was saying I'd walked across the highway and into that building. I didn't yet know the word labyrinth or even maze, but I described things well enough that Mom said I must have dreamed the building had a maze inside. I described the panic of moving from hallway to hallway, making turns and coming back again to places I'd been, only not being sure they were the same, growing more and more lost and wishing for home. I remember feeling relieved that she understood something of what I was saying and could put a name to it, but there were other parts I could not convey. I didn't have the words for the creatures inside the labyrinth, or maybe I wanted to push their images far from my mind. Now, Mom shakes her head slowly, her lips tight together. I wish I did remember, she says. She's lying, but I can't guess why. I guess it's a little early for me, I say when the others talk about getting sleepy. I want to know Chloe a little, that's all. There has to be more under the surface. When they're gone, I move over to Mom's recliner so I can see her and say, how are things, really? She glances up at the pencils keep scratching. I feel stupid and small. After a long while, she says, do you really not know why you're in that motel? No, do you? I say. I sound mocking, like I'm saying, of course you don't know. She says, Grandma left Grandpa, or she tried to. She tried a couple of times when you were all really little, and she told me about it. She's always complaining about him and about you. My expression must make her think I doubt that, so she adds, whenever you hear someone shit-talking other people, you have to know they're doing the same to you as soon as your back is turned. But it doesn't matter. Forget I even said it. No, I mean, I believe you, I say. Mom does talk about everyone. Chloe says, I remembered the dream itself, but I never heard the frame of it, you know? I didn't know you were in the motel when you had it, or that you and Grandma had talked about it. The dream I always thought was creepy, but I'm more interested in what surrounds it, the building and the field and all. I'd only seen half the story, and hearing about the other part, the waking part, gives me a lot more insight. Who told you about the dream, though? I say. She lowers the sketch pad for the first time and gazes into me. No one told me I was there. I smile in confusion. I followed right behind you, but you don't believe things like that, so never mind. Forget I said anything. So wait, I say, shifting to face her more directly. You're saying you dreamed it too? More earnest than I've ever seen her, she nods. Okay, but I was a kid when I dreamed it. You were 20-some years from being born. She sighs a long, frustrated sigh. Time doesn't matter. I see the dream you had when you were a kid just as easily as I see the one you had last night. But I didn't dream last night, I say. You did. She twists her mouth in a grimace. You dreamed about sitting and listening to Grandpa lecture you back when you were little, when you still respected him. You were sitting right here. I don't know what to think of this. It's an odd and a silly game on one hand. On the other, it's something. It's some personality shining through. I ask, so why are you stalking me in my dreams? She says, I don't want you to feel special. At first, I was limited, but I can see in it to anyone's now. Or feel a little special if you want to. I visited your dreams a lot at the start because you were such a snob, you know? I figured if you thought so much of yourself, you might have gone interesting places. A snob? So that's the shorthand for me, the essence. I shouldn't be surprised, but I am. I say, okay, so did I go interesting places? She says, I thought so at first. That maze dream was a trip. Do you remember what you saw inside? Vaguely. Clowns, but it was more than that. I give Chloe a sort of gesture. She says, you didn't have words for what all it was. Clowns, you probably said, but when you saw the other things later in your life, I bet you always felt a little shiver. There were a lot of clowns of different types, like your typical birthday clowns and hamburger clowns and court jesters, those French clown dolls with the porcelain faces. There were mannequins, ventriloquist dummies, but there were also centaurs and fauns and things like that. Not up close, but if you looked further in the background, there were sirens. There were not mermaids, but there were things like that. And none of them were dolls. They weren't people dressed up. They were creatures born that way. You were sure of that. If one had a red nose and another had a jaw only partly connected to the rest of its face, and another had the legs of a deer, they were born that way. They weren't human. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much for that great reading. There's so much I like about that. I love that you left it at the point where there's creatures in the labyrinth, or there are things in the labyrinth, and it illustrates something else about horror, where often side by side, at least for me, with the sense of horror or a sense of dread, is also a sense of awe or a sense of wonder. And I really got that from your story, and that's something I really like about the story, and I like about stories in general. It's such a wondrous element you created, that there's, the shared dreams, and I just love the way, it's a great character. I love the way she just reveals it. She's like, oh, the revelations. She's like, yeah, I was there. He's like, you dreamed it too? He's like, no, I was there. You weren't born yet. Timey-wimey, time doesn't matter. I mean, it was so well done. It was really great. And it was great along the line. All three of these stories tonight had a great synchronicity about. I felt like they were just going deeper and deeper into the labyrinth, into the world of dreams. So it was really fun to hear you three read. And I want to ask you, before we go, I do want to ask you three about your work. I wanted to do that before you read, but I forgot. So before we take off, I'll tell everyone tuning in, if I can get it straight, the book is A Darkness Visible. So thank you so much to Joe Kaplan, Brian Evenson, and Christie Nogle, who have stories in the book. I have a short story in the book as well. It's called A Loch Ness Monster Under the Light of the Southern Cross. My most recent book is called The Serpent's Shadow. It's out from Cemetery Dance Publications. Christie, what else are you working on? Where can people connect with you? And what's your most recent book where people can catch up with you with?
ChristieNogle.com and Christie Nogle across social media. And I had 2 collections out this year, The Best of Our Past, The Worst of Our Future, and Promise.
Fantastic. Joe, where can people connect with you, and where can they read more of your work? You're muted. Let's see if that's on my end or not. There.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Oh no, I'm one of those people. My website is joe-kaplan.com. My most recent novel, When the Night Bells Ring, which came out last year, it just came out. The paperback version was just released this month. So, if you don't like hardcovers, then that's available. I have another one that I've written, but we'll see what happens with it.
I'm sure great things will happen. Keep us posted. We'll be checking it out in due time as well. Brian, where can people read more of your work? What's the latest, and where can people connect with you?
So as an editor, the only real editorial project I've done is the McSweeney's volume, number 71, which is the horror issue. And so if you get a chance, I'd say look at that. As a writer, the most recent book there's a little teeny book that came out in England called Black Bark, which is all Weird West stories, some of which are published in other books of mine and some not, but it's part of the Black Shuck Shadow series. So it's these really micro collections that are really affordable, like $5 or $6. And then I'm working on I just finished actually a sequel to Last Days, my novel called Phantom Limb, and that's with my agent now. So hopefully one day that will be out. We'll see.
looking forward to it all. If you three will just, while we sign out, stay in the room just for a minute. And so thank you to you three for the excellent readings. Thank you to those who tuned in. The next Nighttime Logic is November 16th with Jayaprakash Satyamurthy and Jeff Ford. And then on December 5th, we'll be having a very New York Krampus celebration with Louisa Colon, Robert Levy, and Ben Francisco. Hope to see you there. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us for A Darkness Visible.